to be here. I'd also like to thank Miles and Mimi for not just founding this festival, but carrying it on with such distinction and joy and inspiration for all these years, 18 years. Just want to make sure everybody can hear. Can everyone hear me okay? Marcy, am I unmuted?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to talk today. I originally called this talk Writing the Other, and then in the course, in the middle of writing it, I changed the title to The Voice of the Other as Muse and Music Maker. So just a little longer title for this. In his visionary classic, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, William Blake avoids the influence of Milton and Dante by undermining their theological tropes with a heretical conceit that wisdom emanates from, of all places, hell. Rather than following the traditionally sublime avenue from Hades to heaven, like Dante and Milton, Blake focuses in a much more radical antinomian way on chthonic forces he called energetic creators, enlightened revolutionaries, even apostates who exist in hell, where they create what he called memorable fancy in defiance of the mind-forged manacles, another phrase from Blake, of conventional morality and religion. One of Blake's most famous proverbs from his ironic hell is his assertion that the most sublime act is to set another before you. This most heavenly teaching testifies to the transformative power of both sympathy and empathy, not just in social terms, but literary ones as well. But the idea of setting another before you also strikes terror in its challenge to encounter difference and strangeness in someone or something else, a strangeness that incites a fear of losing oneself in another. While there are hundreds of traditional and contemporary poems that endure as icons of otherness or alterity, I'd like to discuss just 3 poems as strong contemporary examples. Actually, I'm going to increase that to like 5 or 6 poems here. Beginning first, however, with a short email exchange I had with a friend and fellow poet, Bill Tremblay, on the dangers of objectifying as opposed to setting another before you, or subjectifying. I quoted the same proverb by Blake to Bill as one of, let's see, could you scroll that up a little bit? Let's see, I quote, to Bill, which Bill responded with the following brilliant response, reminding me of how essential the other is as a subject for subjectifying. Blake's quote, Blake's project is to re-subjectify what has formerly been objectified by use of the imagination in such way as to create compassion. That's why I used Rilke's archaic torso of Apollo as an example. Rilke shows us line by line in this sonnet how a process of re-subjectifying actually works. It is the light that shines out of the marble. I have the poem here, but maybe I will read that a little later. I'm going to discuss it in the next paragraph or so. But what does subjectifying have to do with technique and craft, you might ask? The answer is simply everything. For subjectifying inspires spare, transformative expression with a sound all its own, a verbal music we don't know we know until we find it within us like a lovesick troubadour or shaman, or beloved sitting at our kitchen table talking to him or herself. By setting another before you, whether it be an object or person, and then crossing over to that person or thing, allows you as the poet to escape into that person or thing in which a most generous muse imparts what Robert Frost called the sound of sense, that musical, mystical diction that conveys as much, if not more, between the lines as in the lines. Here's an example of this verbal magic from Frost's lengthy monologue, A Servant to Servants. This is just a few lines from this long poem, but I think you will hear this sound of sense so clearly. With a house full of hungry men to feed, I guess you'd find, it seems to me, I can't express my feelings any more than I can raise my voice or want to lift my hand. Oh, I can lift it when I have to. Did ever you feel so? I hope you never. It goes on like this, as if he's actually dictating from one of the servants. Frost's speaker appears to be talking as much to himself as he does to his fellow servants in this poem. Yankee speech hangs in the air throughout this raw apostrophe, in which Frost sustains what Dan Chasen, in a recent review of Frost's letters in the New York Review of Books, describes as the primal elements that coming out in meaning making by selection, his prosody in action. Frost dream, Chasen continues, of sentences stripped of their words, pared down to their sentence sounds, those brute tones of our human throat that may once have been all our meaning. What Chasen calls Frost's prosody in action. So, what then is the magic in the poet's ventriloquizing another, in transforming herself into a multitude, in divining the disinterested cipher in the clutch of what John Keats called uncertainty, mystery, doubt, in his definition of negative capability, that complicates the poet sublimely, freeing her from the gravity of herself alone via the imaginative act of subjectifying? Assignments follow these questions rather than prescriptive answers. What does the stone cry out? What does the flower sing? What does the cloud preach? What does the prisoner think? What does the caged panther feel? Did Rilke know his poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo, was destined to become a sonnet? I doubt it. He found its form after scribbling its first few lines in his notebooks, maybe even in prose first. It's always the same with good poems. The music arrives naturally in the poet's deep dive into her embryonic subject. An invisible musician waits for the words. A spiritual force weds content to sound. You witness this marriage between the oral, A-U-R-A-L, and the oral, O-R-A-L, immediately in Rilke's subjectification of Apollo's statue. We will never know his magnificent head, the ebb and flow of his youth, an orchard or ripening fruit, yet his fire has not diminished. Incandescent light radiates from his torso, and in the curve of his loins, a smile turns toward the center of creation. Or else, this body would be disfigured, a lump of rock with no vision, unable to glisten like a lion's mane. It would not burst out of its skin like a star, for its searing gaze penetrates your soul the way you live. Or in these profoundly simple lines from Herbert Mason's translation of Gilgamesh, all that is left to one who grieves is convalescence, no change of heart or spiritual conversion, for the heart has changed and the spirit has converted to a thing that sees how much it costs to lose a friend it loved. Subjectify, subjectify. One of the most celebrated American poems that is as instructive for writers as it is revelatory in its speaker's traverse from self to other is Elizabeth Bishop's poem In the Waiting Room. While waiting for her Aunt Consuelo, Bishop overhears her cry out in pain from the dentist chair, a cry that triggers Bishop's first strange epiphany. This precocious experience terrifies her in a sudden episode of depersonalization in which she sees her 6-year-old self transmogrify into her aunt, whom she describes as a foolish, timid woman. In a sense, that sounds almost like science fiction. Bishop experiences herself as other in the ironic host of her aunt, but rather than feel foolish and timid, she perceives herself as other, as one of them too, as if one of them were as strange and different as an alien. She gains what Philip Larkin calls in his poem Talking in Bed, a unique distance from isolation. What took me completely by surprise was that it was me, my voice in my mouth, Without thinking at all, I was my foolish aunt. We were falling, our eyes glued to the cover of the National Geographic, February 1918. I said to myself, 3 days and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into cold, blue-black space. But I felt, you are an I, you are an Elizabeth, you are one of them. Why should you be one too? I scarcely dared to look to see what it was I was. I gave a sidelong glance. I couldn't look any higher at shadowy gray knees, trousers and skirts and boots and different pairs of hands lying under the lamps. I knew that nothing stranger had ever happened, that nothing stranger could ever happen. Why should I be my aunt or me or anyone? What similarities, boots, hands, the family voice I felt in my throat, or even the National Geographic, and those awful hanging breasts held us all together or made us all just one. How? I didn't know any word for it. How unlikely. How had I come to be here like them and overhear a cry of pain that could have got loud and worse, but hadn't? In her brief, frightening moment of depersonalization, Bishop perceives herself as both other and herself, with a parallax vision that she can't sustain for long. Her intensely close proximity to cold, blue-black space afflicts her with a sensation of falling off the round, turning world in this terrifying I-thou encounter with herself as other and the person of herself and her aunt. She realizes in the course of this self-revealing, self-delighting poem that the voice of the other in the poem, her aunt, Consuelo, the African matron, Osa and Martin Johnson, who emerged so spontaneously, are also her muses, imparting not only the poem's content, but the poem's sonic velocity as well, in perfect iambic trimeter. The next poem I'd like to discuss as an iconic example of transpersonal utterance is James Wright's Hook. Like Bishop's in the waiting room, it shoots down the page as a transcription of the voice Wright hears internally as other in the person of a young Sioux. It's just interesting to note here before I read this poem that he actually wrote this poem and To a Blossoming Pear Tree as the same poem. And then he decided that the poem was too crowded with these two subjects, the Native American in Hook and the gay speaker he's speaking to into a blossoming pear tree. So he turned the two poems in this one poem into two poems. And this wasn't actually discovered until Annie Wright, James Wright's widow, was going through his papers at the University of Minnesota and found the original draft of the poem. Hook. I was only a young man in those days. On that evening, the cold was so goddamned bitter, there was nothing. I was in trouble with a woman, and there was nothing there but me and dead snow. I stood on the street corner in Minneapolis, lashed this way and that. Wind rose up from some pit hunting me. Another bus to St. Paul would arrive in 3 hours if I was lucky. Then the young Sioux loomed beside me. His scars were just my age. Ain't got no bus here a long time, he said. You got enough money to get home on? What did they do to your hand? I answered. He raised up his hook into the terrible starlight and slashed the wind. Oh, that, he said. I had a bad time with a woman. Here, you take this. Did you ever feel a man hold 65 cents in a hook and place it gently in your freezing hand? I took it. It wasn't the money I needed, but I took it. Love how took rhymes with hook at the end of that poem. The first draft of this was originally embedded in a longer poem that included the first draft of To a Blossoming Pear Tree, as I've just mentioned. Both poems convey a radical, emphatic interaction between Wright and unlikely destitute others, but Wright wisely realized that both the Sioux in Hook and the gay stranger into a blossoming pear tree needed their own stages. In Hook, Wright exhibits his social genius for divining the reverse current of giving by taking the 65 cents that the Sioux offers him after Wright asks him, "What did they do to your hand?" Wright, in his signature cathartic way that one sees also in such poems as St. Judas, the Minneapolis poem, to the Muse at an executed murderer's grave, and in response to a rumor that the oldest whorehouse in Wheeling, West Virginia has been condemned, grasps the ironic calculus of receiving by taking, despite his own lack of need, the intangible human currency that this act transacts is priceless. The last poem I'd like to discuss, the last poem I'd like to discuss, in which the speaker becomes a multitude and one person via her poetic transport or passport of accurate empathy, and in which the poet discovers the poems from form in the voice of the other, is Lucille Clifton's Jasper, Texas, 1998. Jasper, Texas, 1998 for Jay Bird. As I think many of you remember, Jay Bird was dragged to death behind a pickup truck in Texas by a white racist. I'm a man's head hunched in the road. I was chosen to speak by the members of my body. The arm, as it pulled away, pointed toward me. The hand opened once and was gone. Why and why and why should I call a white man brother? Who is the human in this place? The thing that is dragged or the dragger? What does my daughter say? The sun is a blister overhead. If I were alive, I could not bear it. The townsfolk sing we shall overcome, while hope bleeds slowly from my mouth into the dirt that covers us all. I'm done with this dust. I'm done. Clifton not only crosses over to the other side in the process of crossing over to the other, James Bird, in this poem, she channels Bird's voice as well in the act of witnessing to the horror of his murder. This was not a new experience for Lucille, crossing over to the afterworld, that is. She often engaged in seances to commune with her mother, Thelma, who died when she was only 44. I asked her about this in the last interview she did 3 weeks before she died in 2010, on the same day her mother died, February 13th. Here's a part of our exchange. You must have missed her terribly. Oh my, we were sitting up on New Year's Eve. We had a piano, which was unusual, and I would sit there trying to play on New Year's Eve. I've never had a New Year's Eve when I didn't cry. Did she die on New Year's Eve? No, it was February, Friday the 13th, whatever year. Note from CD, that's for me. Lucille herself died on this day in 2010, a week and a half after this interview. It was 1959, but there was something about ... something about another year she's not going to be, she's not coming back. While it's the beginning of a lot of stuff, New Year's Eve, it's not the beginning for others. When you started hearing her voice, receiving those poems and the ones who talk, what was that like for you? Because it was your mother with whom you were communicating. You hesitated to say it was my mother. I did, but it was my mother. Although Clifton isn't channeling James Bird in this poem, Jasper, Texas, via the Ouija board, which he liked to use in channeling her mother, she is nonetheless crossing over to him, conjuring both powerful poetic expression and an effective free verse form that's both hers and Bird's, with her signature lowercase denoting universality throughout the poem. Lucille's voice conflates with Bird spontaneously. I'm not sure how long Clifton worked on this poem, but my suspicion is it emerged in need of no revision in her first draft. So there is a Vedic quality to poems in which the speaker crosses over. The muse's voice is multifarious and Catholic with that small c. Clifton's poem speaks with the resonance and character of utterance. I'm sure she would say, like her close friend Ruth Stone, that she didn't write it. There are, of course, in addition to the poems above, myriad other contemporary poems that focus on the eclectic other, and I should also add electric, for their sublime subject matter. Here's a very partial list of poets whose poems contain transpersonal speakers who take the risk of encountering strange others in the paradoxical sublime practice of discovering sameness behind difference. I don't think I'm going to read all these names, but if you could scroll down slowly, you will see the examples of poems by poets, well-known poets who write about the other so effectively and movingly and successfully. This was a list I just came up with off the top of my head and also with a little research, but maybe folks behind the screen can make this list available to everybody, either as a record, a recording, or as an email. I really would love to write about each one at some point or another. So in addition to this American list, it is primarily an American list, myriad international examples need to be included also. I would suggest reading Poetry International, which the poet Ilya Kaminsky edited for several years, as a valuable resource of contemporary international voices. All poets write, whether consciously or unconsciously, to be translated into languages that may be vastly different from their own and in forms that are also vastly different. So how have such ancient poets and books of poetry as Gilgamesh, the Odyssey, the Divine Comedy, Song of Songs, Song of Innocence, Songs of Innocence and Experience, the Tao Te Ching, along with hundreds of others, survived in foreign languages, if not by betraying their sources as an other or others, whether animate or inanimate, who tapped into a universal expression behind each of their native languages, in transcriptions that the other dictated in his or her paradoxical human capacity as a multitude to the singular poet, whose transpersonal muse provided a verbal toolbox that was replete with figurative instruments, ancient, present voices, generous revelations, self-instructive forms, and ironic truths. And here's just a little addendum I added as a Ars Poetica, as a craft lecture that I wrote several years ago in my head when a student asked me what kind of poems I liked, and I wrote, "Oh, give me a poem where the anapests roam and the dactyls and iambs do play, where never is heard a superfluous word, and the lines always mean more than they say." Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for that talk, Chard. It's good to be with you all this afternoon. There are 4 poems in your handout, but we're only going to look at 2 of them. I'll start with a quick content note. This lecture does discuss violence, misogyny, and racism. You can feel free to engage or disengage in whatever way seems appropriate to you. And today I want to talk about one challenge a writer might encounter in their writing: how to write about some kind of public or political issue or social issue when the issue just seems too big. I'll start with an example from my own writing practice. For a long time, I was trying to write a series of poems about mixed race identities. Even if not writing directly about this topic, I often imagine there's some trace element of that and that identity embedded in my poems. But if I wanted to make that more overt, to put it at the center of a poem, what exactly would a reader need to know? Would they need to know that the speaker, i.e. me, is both Asian and white, that my mother's side of the family is specifically Filipino American, that the speaker in this poem is rarely visually identified as such, or that as a child, when people saw him with his mother, they'd see this woman of color and this white-looking child and would assume his mother was a nanny and would inquire about her services, or that sometimes people would see me and my brother and my brother, who looks more like my mother, and ask if we were really half brothers or maybe step brothers, and did we know for sure, and could we prove this? Anyway, I recently moved into a new house, and in moving, I uncovered some photos from this childhood that I'm telling you about. And so I'd like you to join me on a 30-second tour of awkward nostalgia. All right, this is me. This is me and my mom. I think I'm explaining capitalism here, or how money works. And then here's me with my mom's family. Let me see if I can make that a little bigger. This is from left to right. That's my Aunt Lou, my little brother, who's now a genius scientist in California. There's me. There's my mom, Tita Mading, Lola. But what I know everyone is really focused on is my awesome footwear here, which you will get a better look at in the next photo. This is me, Bert and Ernie slippers, Superman cape, general look of existential anguish here. Very little has changed. But our story really begins when these two met. My parents met in 1971, if you ask my father, or in 1972, if you ask my mother. My mom was working at Hudson's and my dad was there looking for a gift for his father. They met, they talked, they laughed. Soon after, they went on a date. It was a wine tasting, I believe. 5 years later, if you ask my dad, or 4 years later, if you ask my mom, they got married and moved into a small flat in the middle of Detroit. There was a tiny wooden table with 2 chairs in the kitchen. Even decades later, after moving up through various levels of middle classness, my dad still talks about that table, waking up early and having breakfast with my mom as the sun was beginning to enter the room, and then just before dawn, heading out to go work at Ford Motor Company. Sometimes I think that was the happiest time of his life. Eventually, they moved to the suburbs. My mom rarely talks about this, but southeastern Michigan in the late 70s and 80s was bluntly a very turbulent place to be Asian in America. The auto industry was failing. Japanese car companies were held up as a scapegoat for this failing American enterprise. Here are a couple less fun images from that time, and I pulled these from the internet, and they were somewhat present everywhere. So this is a bumper sticker: Datsun, Toyota, Nissan. Remember Pearl Harbor. There are lots of things like this on lawn signs, T-shirts, things like Buy American and Americans Work, and things like this. What you're looking at here is members of United Auto Workers Local 588. These types of things were charity events where people could pay $1 to take a swing at a Toyota with a baseball bat or a sledgehammer. That's where I grew up. The interior home life was fairly idyllic. The world beyond was full of turmoil. The last 2 images we looked at, here and here, are anecdotal pieces of a larger system that created a violent atmosphere. and that hostility was directed toward all Asian Americans. One of the defining moments of this era in Detroit was the murder of Vincent Chin, beaten to death in June of 1982 by two white auto workers with baseball bats in a McDonald's parking lot. It was the week before his wedding. His killers got a $3,000 fine and probation. The judge explained that lenient sentence by saying, "These weren't the kind of men you send to jail." This was a watershed moment in Asian American history and also in terms of imagining an Asian American identity. The phrase Asian American is actually somewhat new. In the early 80s, it wasn't exactly in common usage, but the collective outrage around this event was in some ways unprecedented in this community, and it became a moment, and several have suggested the moment in Detroit when many people of disparate backgrounds began to see themselves collectively as Asian Americans rather than exclusively as Filipino Americans, Korean Americans, etc. I've now devoted approximately 800 words to this subject, and if I were writing a poem, this is a lot of context to wedge into a villanelle. Often I'd try and the poems would be a total mess. So the question I'm wrestling with is how to write a poem when the issue can't be simplified because the stakes are too high, or the story is really many stories, none of which can be ignored. And here's my advice: write about something smaller. I'm not saying to ignore the larger issue. That should be part of the poem. Write about it directly if you can, as directly as you can. This is about how to approach these subjects only if it seems like there's just too much, how to enter that immensity. And the approach I'm considering is to direct a reader's attention towards something smaller, a more personal storyline that, when placed against the larger crisis, creates a corresponding resonance. I'll offer a visual model for this strategy, and this model will be a massive tonal shift in this lecture. But we're going to watch 1 minute of a popular TV crime procedural from the early 1990s. I'll summarize the events that lead up to this scene. In the show, it's 1993, Bellafleur, Oregon. The body of a 21-year-old woman named Karen Swenson is found by local detectives in the woods. There's no discernible cause of death, but there were a couple unusual red dots on her back. That catches the attention of a young FBI agent on the other side of the country. That agent is an Oxford-educated criminal psychologist who previously had been considered one of the strongest analysts in the FBI's violent crimes division. He notices that those marks on Swenson's back bear an uncanny resemblance to two other unsolved cases, one in Sturgis, South Dakota, and one in Shamrock, Texas. What could possibly explain this? It was a question that no one wanted to answer, no one except that one FBI agent, because that agent was named Fox Mulder. Fox Mulder was, in the words of Division Chief Scott Blevins, obsessed with an unassigned project outside the Bureau mainstream, rooted in paranormal activity. His ideas had little grounding in science, so the FBI assigned him a new partner, Dana Scully, a medical doctor who is to become the rational counterbalance to the more intuitive Mulder, and together they flew to Oregon to investigate. Their case eventually involved lights in the sky, the comatose son of a local detective, exhumed graves, people with strange nosebleeds, a grave containing the decomposed remains of what might be an alien or an orangutan, a strange cylindrical implant extracted from the nasal cavity of this unidentifiable body, the claim that by at least one individual that this implant was actually an alien communication device. Then the autopsy lab gets ransacked and the alien or orangutan body is stolen. Then Scully and Mulder's hotel burns to the ground. It's a possible cover-up. All evidence has been destroyed, all except that one little metal implant, which Scully had in her pocket and brought back to headquarters because Dana Scully is the only one on this planet who has her shit together. Their investigation was, of course, meticulously documented in the 1993 pilot episode of The X-Files. The person you see in the following scene is referred to in the script as the smoking man because he usually just smokes cigarettes and observes things in a mysterious manner. He's carrying the little alien implant that Scully and Mulder found earlier in the episode. That cylinder that he's holding acts as a symbol. Symbols acquire non-literal connotations by absorbing the context in which they're used. To viewers of this episode, the device absorbs the context of all the events that preceded it. The lights in the sky, the alien graves, the nefarious cover-up, all of it. We associate this little device with every part of the story. Prior to this scene, we assume the drama we're watching unfold is unique. But in this final scene, as the cylinder is placed next to 5 similar cylinders, and as the agent walks away and we're shown hundreds of similar boxes, we understand the individual story to represent countless untold other stories. How long would those stories take to tell? The show's creators absolutely want viewers to understand the enormity of their subject, but they communicate that vastness not by showing everything at once, but by showing only a fragment of the whole. One story, one implant, then the individual story is made to imply something more than itself. This is the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm, and I'm operating on the idea that each is represented in the other. In philosophy, religion, and early sciences, this idea was kicked around for centuries, often suggesting that a human is a model for A, the world, or B, the entire universe. An early reference attributed to Anaximenes said, "Just as our soul, which is air, holds us together, so it is breath and air that encompasses the whole world." Maybe a century later, Democritus said, "Man is a universe in little." Aristotle said, "For if it happens in the microcosm, it can also happen in the macrocosm." Many centuries later, Emerson said, "Each particle is a microcosm and faithfully renders the likeness of the world." And then there's Montaigne's famous claim that, quote, "Each man bears the entire form of man's estate." I don't know if any of that is scientifically legit, but it works great as a metaphor for our topic, so I'm running with it. In poetry, there's a symbiotic relationship between small and large, individual and collective, internal and external, private and public. And so the technical device we're talking about here is synecdoche. Usually synecdoche is something most poets either can't spell or confuse with metonymy. Every poet has a list of their top 10 favorite figurative moves, and synecdoche rarely makes the cut, even though it's kind of the best one. In its most simple terms, it's a figurative device where the part represents the whole. In his 1941 article, Four Master Tropes in Kenyon Review, Kenneth Burke gives a more expansive definition, saying, quote, "For this purpose, we consider synecdoche in the usual range of dictionary sense with such meanings as part for the whole for the part, container for the contained, sign for the thing signified, material for the made thing, which brings us nearer to metonymy, cause for effect, effect for cause, genus for species, species for genus, etc. All such conversions imply an integral relationship, a relationship of convertibility between the two terms," unquote. Let's look at the poem The Jungle by Carrie Fountain. The Jungle. In motherhood, I begin to celebrate my own smallest accomplishments, as when I wake to find I've slept through the night and I feel a little healed, because sleeping is something I didn't learn how to do until I was an adult and had to read a book about it, because I've always liked to joke I was raised by wolves. I was raised by wolves was in fact the very joke I made in explaining to a fellow mom as the children's theater went dark that, like my own young son, I was seeing The Jungle Book for the first time. "I don't even know what it's about," I said. "I was sort of raised by wolves," I said and laughed. And then when the curtain went up, the curtain went up, and I was shocked, of course, to find The Jungle Book is about a boy who was raised by wolves. And I am shocked again now, having just Googled it, to find the #1 query associated with Rudyard Kipling is The Jungle Book a real story? People are dumb. is what I was thinking. I admit when I read that, but then I clicked and found that, oh my God, the Jungle Book is based on the story of a feral boy running on all fours alongside a wolf in an Indian jungle, which is funny to me because feral is the word that has always come to mind when I think of the boys I grew up with, those boys who moved through the world with the ease afforded to those who didn't give two shits about anything, who'd empty beer cans in seconds, wrapped cars around poles, all while joking about fucking each other's mothers. They were feral in the desert shooting guns out by the airport. They were feral on their skateboards in the Whataburger parking lot. They were feral because they were allowed to be, and eventually we'd all get in trouble for what they'd been doing, even us girls who, what did we do all that time while the boys were fighting and spitting and calling us whores? I don't know. We were talking to each other, I guess, which is how we became human, but no, those boys weren't feral. Those boys were typical. They'd been born knowing the world would be theirs long after they'd grown bored of nihilism and turned their attention to capital, became men, became mankind, the kind of men who'd ruin something if it meant they got to keep it, who'd kill something if it meant they could see it up close, maintain the illusion of having owned it, having earned it, even who track a boy and a wolf through the jungle for days until finally they had them trapped inside their own den. When those men found they couldn't lure the boy out with words, they forced him out with smoke. And when the boy finally stepped out into the sunlight, those men captured him, bound him, and when the wolf, who was the boy's mother, came following close behind, the way at intermission, I followed my own son, who is by now too old to come with me to the women's room, to the very threshold of the men's room door. When she came out behind him, they shot her. Here, the macrocosm is patriarchy, misogyny, toxic masculinity, massive subjects. These are the big picture ideas, but the focus here is on the life of the speaker. One moment in a theater, the memories of the boys she grew up with, her son who she follows to the restroom and realizes that he's growing up and growing toward an uncertain future. This sequence makes up the sequence that makes up a local event as a microcosm. We understand it as a microcosm because of the backdrop of the play she's there to see, and the history of the creation behind that play, which places her personal experience against the context of something larger. This works in a similar fashion to that alien implant from the X-Files. Here, the speaker's life is placed next to the historic, and the implication is the speaker's anxiety is part of a much larger public dilemma. Fountain's poem shows one part essentially morphing into the other, one story becoming indistinguishable from the other, as she describes those feral boys from her past. Boys who'd kill something if it meant they could see it up close, maintain the illusion of having owned it, having earned it, even who'd track a boy and a wolf through the jungle for days. With those lines, one part actually becomes the other. This is what Kenneth Burke means when he says the relationships between the parts in Synecdoche have a relationship of convertibility. Here, when Fountain says, even who track a boy and a wolf through the jungle, the boys from the speaker's past have been converted into the men that inspired the story she watched develop on a stage. But instead of part for whole, genus for species, container for contained, we have a type of convertibility between the present day and history, between the boys she knew and men from across time, between America and the other side of the globe. As figures from the speaker's life fuse with events of the past, the thematic currents of her personal story are magnified. They become ageless and eternal. As her story merges with one on the other side of the planet, her story's subtext and undercurrents are expanded to encompass the entire world. The individual story becomes a global one. It transcends its own singular context to imply many others. The part represents the whole. Next, I'd like to look at Gate A4 by Naomi Shihab-Nye, which has a very different bone structure in terms of thinking about how Synecdoche works, and we will listen to her reading it.
Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal, after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing. "Help," said the flight agent. "Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this." I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke haltingly. "Shu dawa, shu bidik habibti, stand shway, min fadlik, shu bitsawi." The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "No, we're fine. You'll get there, just late. Who is picking you up? Let's call him." We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons, just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, from her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo. We were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There's no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country, traveling tradition. Always carry a plant. Always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones and thought, this is the world I want to live in, the shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost.
This poem, Gate A4, gestures toward its macrocosm only briefly. I see it most clearly in this exchange. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Here, readers have to consider why someone might pause in such a situation. In that one sentence, the larger world beyond the local scene is alluded to, but something's been omitted. So we fill in the blank. We supply the omitted material. We take what we know of the world, of racial profiling, of American wars, of then and now, of if you see something, say something, of anger and violence and suspicion, and apply that context to this sentence in this poem, and that creates our initial sense of anxiety. Tone can be thought of as the speaker's emotional position toward the subject matter, and our feelings toward the subject matter are often determined by the speaker's tone, the speaker's feelings toward the subject. One pauses these days suggests a tone of nervousness or a sense of apprehension. We're allowed to feel some relief from that anxiety as the speaker experiences relief and even delight. We relax as she begins to relax. Then we get to this ending. This is the world I want to live in, the shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. I find this to be both incredibly hopeful and intensely sad. Hopeful because it can still happen anywhere. Sad because we know that it doesn't happen everywhere. Hopeful because not everything has been lost. Heartbreaking because so much has been lost already. Here, the part doesn't represent the whole. Instead, the whole pressurizes the part. The macrocosm is the world we know. The microcosm is the world as it could be. The poem's emotional gravity comes from readers inferring the disparity between those two competing realities. These two poems are very different. One brings in a lot of the external world and considers the implications head on. The other only briefly points to the world beyond the localized scene. What they have in common is that they're built around a subjective personal experience, a woman in an airport, a mom in a theater. That's the thing I'm arguing for. If your poem is about some large issue, some social dilemma, the story is where an individual life intersects with that issue. I don't know if the poems we looked at today are true with a capital T or autobiographical with a capital A, but I'm thinking about that younger version of myself I was telling you about earlier. The murder of Vincent Chin was a transformative cultural event during a defining period in my life. When it happened, I was too young to understand the moment's magnitude, but the significance of that event intensified and deepened for me. With each passing years, my ability to comprehend the context of that moment grew, and as my ability to understand myself inside that context continued to expand. Maybe the poem that would need to be written as a history lesson, a chronicle of a city in the years before and after, or maybe it's a persona poem where I imagine myself into the life of this man I never knew one violent night 40 years ago somewhere near my home. Or maybe it's a moral argument thinking of endemic problems. Maybe, and these poems might be excellent poems in another person's hands. But for me, it's more likely that the more authentic, more moving poem might not be about the specific event or the details surrounding it, but maybe it's about a father in the early 1980s trying to explain this moment in time to a child after that child overheard something at school. Or maybe it's two brothers who look a little different and will forever be received by the world in different ways. Or maybe it's about their father and mother, a love story that grew despite an atmosphere that was utterly antagonistic toward that love story's existence, but a story which I'm told can still happen anywhere. I don't know. None of these possibilities defined a generation or catalyzed a movement, and it's possible some of us might resist these supposedly smaller aspects of the larger subject because there's a tendency to doubt the validity of one's own lived experience. But I think this pull between micro and macro can be profoundly comforting. If one embodies or represents the other, then each of the individual elements forming the collective must hold something in common with the next. If the part truly represents the whole, that means there are other similar parts in motion at all times, each orbiting and illuminating the more expansive truth. And then your own small story, when viewed in this manner, isn't as small as it might seem. If something moves you, that means it will move others as well. Container for the contained, sign for the signified, material for the made thing, personal anecdote for a necessary public reckoning. That's you, a microcosm, a little model of the universe, just one point of light in a sprawling cosmos. That might feel overwhelming, but if you are a reflection of countless others, that means you're not alone. You're connected to each, a fragment of the luminous thing, but also the thing itself. Thank you.